call 1-800-NOAH today, right? Showers of blessing. We should sing showers of blessing today. All right. I feel ring the bells of heaven. Okay. So Tristan, is he back there? Mr. Delgadillo? Or the, I think he's bringing the teenagers. Is he bringing the teenagers in here? Hi. You guys are in here. You already knew that. It's ringing a bit there. Okay. So this morning, today and all day today, Dr. Phil Stringer is going to be with us. He'll be speaking our Sunday school hour in our morning service, and then tonight at 6. I'd love to have you come back for that. Today's 9/11, right? So you guys remember what happened? Some of you remember. The teenagers don't. But Katie was a baby when all that happened, 2001. And wow, it rocked our world, didn't it? Completely. So when I looked at the calendar and realized September 11th was coming, I was able to get Dr. Stringer here on this date. And he is, in my opinion, one of the leading historians in our fellowship. Teaches a lot on history and Bible history, church history, and has a lot of the stuff from the top of his head. He's a good friend. He serves as the president or vice president of Dayspring. And are you the vice president or the president of King James Bible? I never know. He's the vice president. He created the King James Bible Research Council, which I'm on the board. And then he made himself the vice president instead of the president. He keeps putting elects other people to lead it, and he just takes the VP position. I appreciate that. But I'm honored to have Dr. Stringer with us today, a good friend from a long ways back. And preacher, come and give us what the Lord's laid on your heart. Make sure that your lapel mic is on.
Got getting ready to have devotions this morning. Couldn't find my Bible anywhere. It wasn't in my room. I went down to the car and it wasn't in my car. So when I came back, I had to borrow a Bible from Brother Hafley. And Brother Hafley has a wide variety of heretical Bibles available for some strange reason. But it's King James text with heretical notes. But we won't be using the notes this morning. It is September the 11th. It stirs a lot of memories for those of us of the right age. 21 years ago, I was at People's Baptist Church in Wellsboro, Kentucky, preaching a revival meeting. And on Monday night, I preached a message I'm going to preach tonight on the judgment of God on the nations. I just preached on the judgment of God on the nations. It was a fairly large church auditorium, a 400-seat auditorium with maybe 100 people in it. Wasn't a terrible crowd, but I mean it wasn't anywhere near filling up the auditorium. And I preached on the judgment of God on the nations, and the next morning we had the September 11 tragedy. Tuesday night, the place was absolutely packed and overflowing. It was really a moment. And I grew up in the inner city. I grew up with noise around. So some people need to get really quiet to study and all that. I need to have a certain amount of noise in the background. So I'll play classical music or have the news on in the background. I'm really not paying full attention. But I had the news in the background while I'm studying in the motel room. And I heard somebody say, this is the comment that broke through to me that I heard, was it's either a terrible accident or a terrorist attack. And I was sitting at the desk and the TV was the other part of the room. So I got up and walked over to the TV just in time to see the second plane hit. And I thought they were replaying what they'd been talking about. I didn't realize I was watching something live happening. But it's a day you never forget by any stretch of the imagination. And of course, immediately I was on the phone. At that time, I was president of Bible College in Florida. And I was on the phone talking to folks. And we had a snack shop the area students would go to relax, buy snacks, whatever. And we had a big screen TV on, and we would sometimes have the TV on for major sporting events or news events. So I immediately called and said, turn the TV on, everybody's going to need to know what's happening. They'll remember this many years later. And so they did, and that, of course, has been with us. And same thing this morning. I'm in the room. I've got the TV on. I'm not watching it. I'm at the desk, sitting at the desk doing things, but I've got the TV on. I've got the news on. And I begin to hear what I recognized immediately as memorial coverage of those events, the same things that were being played at that day. And here we are, 21 years later, and it's an interesting question to ask, how much have we learned? I had Thursday, the meeting was over on Wednesday. I was supposed to fly back on Thursday, but all the airlines were grounded. So I had to rent a car. Had to get the pastor to drive me up into Indiana, which is our closest we could find a car rental available, rent a car and drive. I drove all the way back to Florida in a day because I had commitments on Friday, and I was younger, and I did crazy things like that then. And I'm going by, and of course I'm listening to the radio nonstop for news. Everybody's asking, who did this? And as you're going by, you were seeing various places that had signs where you could change the message, and everybody, God bless America, God bless the USA, God bless America. Pulled off in Georgia to get a meal, drove by a strip club, and they had changed their sign saying, God bless the USA. And my first thought was, I wonder what God they are referring to. But it was an amazing moment, an amazing response. And a week later, any lessons that could be learned seemed to have been forgotten. It's amazing. That to me was the most amazing part of the whole thing. And it was, and I remember the very next Sunday, I was preaching in Miami, and going down to Miami and driving through some of the ethnic neighborhoods to get to the church I was preaching at. Went through a Vietnamese neighborhood, and they're waving Vietnamese flags and American flags. And drove through a couple of Hispanic neighborhoods, and they're waving various flags, but waving the American flag. And one thing I will never, ever forget as long as I live. That January, I went to the Philippines, as I always did. And there's a church I would preach at in the Philippines. It's right next to the Philippine version of the Pentagon, and a very military church. Thousands of people, but many of them connected to the military. In fact, they had a set of ushers, Brother Hafley, that any pastor would envy having. Their ushers were all Navy SEALs. And they would march down in absolute uniformity. I mean, they were just, everybody was at the exact same place. It was like a military drill, and they never cracked a smile. And they all had a look on their face like, I've killed people before, please give. And I mean, I'm just sitting on a platform watching them say, I wish I had ushers like that, you know. But I'll never forget, as long as I live, that Sunday that I was at that church, they just had Special Forces graduation the night before. And many of them were in the service. And they brought me, I still have it, I'll always have it, the program for Special Forces graduation, and they had all signed it, and they'd put a note on the bottom of it, said, we will get Al-Qaeda. We'll do it for the Philippines, and we'll do it for the United States. And they did battle Al-Qaeda in Mindanao for several years after that, and destroyed the Al-Qaeda presence there. And but that's a memory I'll always have. I wanted to talk a little bit this morning, if you go to me, one verse of scripture, but I want to use it as a background for this. And it is a truth about government. We've lost the fact that the Bible gives us all the basic truths about government that we need to know, because we've been told the Bible doesn't have anything to say about government or civic or public life. And that's been drilled into us so much we act as if it was true, and it's not. Proverbs chapter 14, verse 34. Righteousness exalteth a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. Again, Proverbs 14:34. We're on here, I think. Proverbs 14:34. Righteousness exalteth a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. Whole evening service will have to do with this, God's judgment on the nations. But it's a simple principle. It's repeated over and over and over again in the Bible. Just as God deals with nations or individuals, which we still seem to recognize for right and wrong, he deals with nations for right and wrong. When a nation does right, God blesses it. When a nation does wrong, God punishes it. It's entirely possible, since there's so many areas that make up national life, for a nation to be doing wrong on one point at a given moment and right on another point, and have blessing and cursing at the same time. I personally believe that's very much the story of the United States of America today. By the way, this is an interesting moment in American history. I've preached this message off and on for 30 years. And for the first time in the last 50 years, the United States is not an official sponsor and promoter of abortion. Now, many of the states are, including our state. Our current governor says he wants to make this the abortion capital of the Midwest. And he said that ought to be the number one issue in the election, making this the abortion capital of the United States. And I hope all the Christian folks will remember that he said that. It's what he wants to be the number one issue. We ought to give him that. And that's the number one issue. And that ought to control how we vote. But it's an interesting moment. But here's the principle. I want to take this principle specifically and apply it to the United States. First of all, asking this question: what creates a nation? How do nations form? Any nation has to have something that unites it together, that makes it a nation distinct from other bodies of people. And nation-forming experiences come very differently. Some are basic geography. An area is surrounded by mountains or oceans or rivers or whatever. There's geography that makes it distinct from everybody else. You look at Australia, obvious example of that, surrounded, it's called a continent, but it's also called an island. It is surrounded by ocean, and it came together with the native peoples there, are united by the geography that separates them. But it also took on courses. The United Kingdom used it as a penal colony to send people that they did not want to have in the general population. And they gave it, if you will, a British flavor. I was just there for the first time in June, and it always fascinates me to listen to Australian folks talk. They have an interesting accent. I came back and changed my GPS to Australian. So I hear that Australian accent and say, turn here. You know. But it's that's the history of Australia. They were united, first of all, by geography. Sometimes nations are formed because they're united by a conqueror who you just force to bring groups of people whose culture is not similar together. That's the background, for example, of many of the Eastern European wars. Nations, like there was a nation of Yugoslavia, which came from forcing three nations together that did not have common culture, common language, or common religion, but they were all under the same conquest. But they were never united. And it would eventually end up in civil wars that would break it up into three nations. But there's always something, a common language, a common religion. Islam creates the definition of many nations in the world. A common nation, or a common something to make a nation. Religion, geography, conqueror, language, something has to provide the unity that creates a nation. And today we celebrate diversity. And sometimes the diversity are good, but you push diversity to its extreme, you have nothing left that unites you as a nation. But the United States is formed as a nation in an absolutely unique fashion. No other nation can claim the same heritage. It interested me that the Queen of England, over the last 71 years, often talked about how great the United States was and what made the United States a unique nation. And I always appreciated that. I thought she had it exactly right. The United States was created as a nation by people that held a common philosophy of government. They got to this point in defiance of geography, because they're mostly people of British background who shared much of the British common approach to life and culture and religion, but they travel as colonists, invading a wilderness and creating, if you will, in the New World, a new society. The challenges of the wilderness, and by the way, there's no easy way for me to say this. I love my American Indian brethren in Christ. I have some that I preach for that I just have the greatest love for. And much of what is told today about the story of the Native American Indian is simply not true. The story, and you see it plastered all over the place, is that evil English colonists came to a continent where there were 70 million American Indians and stole everything from them, and just simply not true. The highest estimate before the new politically correct projections was that there was 1.5 million Indians spread over the whole of North America. Millions and millions of acres where nobody lived. And tribes would claim a big area because once upon a time, their tribe had gone there somewhere in distant memory, had a hunting trip in that area. And the English colonists, as well as other colonists, they would look at all this. You can't have millions of acres with a handful of people. Somehow that doesn't make sense. And the Indian tribes were very, very consistent in saying they did not believe anyone could own the land, that anybody owned it. So they constantly felt free to move. They felt free to drive people off land that were on it because then nobody owns the land. And the fact they didn't believe in ownership of land left them in a weakened condition when anybody else wanted to come and claim the land they were on. It was their culture. It's a very socialistic, nature-worshiping culture. They didn't do much in terms of invention, and because they were a nature-worshiping culture. They were never united. You often get this picture of the colonists or the Americans or American government fighting the Indians. There was never any such war. There were over 500 Indian tribes. Most of them were at war with each other all the time. And you never find a war that took place that wasn't the Americans and some of the Indian tribes against other Indian tribes. In Custer's last stand, there were over 20 American Indians killed that served as scouts for Custer's 7th Cavalry. Just for example. It's nowhere near the simple story that you hear in these days. But you have this vast land. I've actually been to Cambodia, and I went to the Cambodian Holocaust Museum. There was a horrible Holocaust in the 1970s in Cambodia where the communists killed 1/3 of the population, and I went to the Holocaust Museum, and they actually have a big display there saying that this is one of the worst Holocausts of all history, but that the Holocaust of the Jews with the Nazis was even worse, and the American Holocaust of exterminating millions and millions of Indians was even worse than the Jewish Holocaust. It's not true. There's simply nothing like that happened. In fact, there's more American Indians today than there ever were. And colonists came. They braved a wilderness. Some of them braved it for economic opportunity. Some of them braved it because they were sent by the government of England to claim new territory for England. But many of them braved it because, yes, traveling across an ocean in those days was a life-challenging expedition. Carving out a new world in a wilderness where the weather, the wild animals, and yes, sometimes the Native Americans were a life-threatening hazard was an incredible challenge. But many of them came because they wanted some aspect of religious freedom, and any challenge was worth it, and any price to be paid was worth it to get religious freedom. I understand. Some of them weren't as committed to religious freedom as we are. Some of them just wanted freedom to be Catholic. Some of them wanted freedom to be Congregationalist. Some of them wanted freedom to be Presbyterians. Some of them wanted freedom to be Quakers. Our Baptist forefathers just wanted religious freedom, period, for everybody. What they had in common was a commitment to some kind of religious freedom, and then others had a commitment to economic freedom. They wanted to live free. They braved the circumstances. They're not the evil people portrayed in the modern educational system, which doesn't mean they never made any mistakes. They came, they wanted to be free. And it's interesting, the timing. The big part of the colonization begins to pick up around the 1700s. If you're reading the average history book, it's portrayed in a different way in my U.S. history books that I have out there. But in different chapters, they'll tell you, the United States begins to develop in strength in the 1720s. And this goes on, and there's a 50-year pro-freedom movement that erupts into a revolution, a war of independence against Mother Britain in the 1770s. In another chapter of a book, the same book maybe, they'll tell you an incredible thing happened in the colonies called the Great Awakening. The preaching of the gospel stirred across the colonies, and in the 1720s, very few people ever attended church. The challenge was survival. You didn't have time for church. And very few people could read because the challenge was for survival. Very few people identified with any religious movement. But this revival stirred, a revival preached, by the way, out of the King James Bible. Some of the folks were Calvinists. Some of the folks were Arminians. Some of the folks believe what we believe, but they're all preaching out of the King James Bible, and they stirred and moved the colonies so that by the 1770s, a majority of the people in the colonies, number one, could read. They learned to read because it was important to read the Bible. They belonged to churches that had the concept of personal salvation in their doctrinal statement. A majority of people belong to such churches. Of the people that we list today as the founders, those who signed the Declaration of Independence or who served on in the Constitutional Convention, all but 3 of them belonged to churches that had the concept of salvation in their church doctrinal statement. You say, well, were they really born again? I don't know that. Frankly, I don't know that about you folks either. I can't see in any of your hearts. I assume, because you go to a church that preaches salvation, that you're saved. But it's not like I can see in anybody's hearts. I've known Brother Hafley for years, and he's a dear friend, and I've watched God work in his life, so I assume he's saved. And I've heard him preach the gospel. I've had him come preach for me when I was a pastor, and I've heard him preach the gospel. But I have to assume he's saved because I cannot see into Brother Hafley's heart. So, how many of those people are really saved? I don't know. But I all know they went to churches that preached salvation, even though they didn't have to. Maybe the first and last time in the history of any country that a majority of the population was born again. And they so desired, as they began to read their Bibles, and they would read what the Bible says about government. There'll be more on that in the morning service. As they began to read what the Bible said about government, they began to want to have a government that matched what the Bible said. And for 40 years, they protested that England was not giving them that government. After 40 years of protest, at the height of the religious revival, this is not a coincidence. These people are reading their Bibles. A significant majority of the preachers are preaching on the concept of what God says about government. Some of the very principles we'll address in a morning service. They begin so to demand The idea of a government that conformed to what the Bible said about government. It breaks out in a war for independence that creates a new nation. And as Queen Elizabeth often mentioned, so did Margaret Thatcher, by the way, the United States was the first nation in the history of the world that was ever formed. So I said, you have to have something in common to be a nation. It's the first nation ever formed by a common philosophy of government held by the majority of the people. They expressed that in the Declaration of Independence, where the Bible teaches in Revelation, or in Romans chapter 13, that the job of government is to promote the good and be a terror to evil. Britain had become the terror that they were afraid of, and not the promoter of good. And to make that case, they list 26 examples of how the government of Britain had become the evil they needed to be afraid of. Just one of them, for example, says they've created a huge number of officers to come over and analyze our wealth and take it from us. I don't know why I remembered that one all of a sudden. But they give 26 examples. Some are pretty serious. They had armed the Indian tribes against the colonists to keep the colonies from spreading west. That's pretty serious. They would arrest people and take them back to England for trial. And even if you were found innocent, it would take up 2, 3, 4 years of your life. And sometimes folks were getting arrested simply because the authorities were upset with them. And they were arrested, and the authorities knew they could not be convicted, but they were arrested anyway as a way of stopping them. I mean, you go through the 26 reasons they give, and then they said, we felt the obligation to explain to the world what we're doing. And they asked that God would show the world the righteousness of their cause. And they go on to defeat the world superpower at that moment. Everybody laughed at the idea of a rebellion by these colonies. They didn't have a single factory that produced weapons. They didn't have a standing army. I mean, this is the biggest joke in the history of the world. Except they win the war for independence and become an independent nation based upon that principle. By the way, and however you feel about this, if you get upset with me, I promise if you disagree, I will not get upset with you, and I'm willing to let you be wrong if you're just willing to let me be right. We can still get along fine. When the Confederacy left the Union, they made the exact same plea in their Declaration of Independence. May God show the world the rightness of our cause. And they lost. And that still comes as a shock to some of my Southern friends. God answered that prayer when the colonists prayed it. Didn't answer that prayer when the Confederacy prayed it. There ought to be some sort of historical lesson in that. Okay? Because the issue in the first case was freedom. And God answered that prayer. And so you have a new nation. It's a new nation. And God blesses it in fashions no one could imagine. The economy grew. It grew in strength. It grew in influence. There's nothing in the history of the world to compare with how the United States grew. 1835, a French historian came to the United States, Alex de Tocqueville. He wrote a book called Democracy in America. The whole reason for his coming was to try and write a book. How did this happen? There's nothing like this in world history. How did this happen? Among the many things he wrote, he said you have to go into America's churches to have any understanding of how this happened. I don't think anybody's going into our churches today finding an explanation of the blessings that the United States has. Our blessings are left over from previous eras. A nation built on a general principle of government that was right and matched the Bible, guess what? Righteousness exalts a nation. Write that down. It's always true. Righteousness exalts a nation. Now, we were not without problems because the nation was not righteous about everything. To this day, the scourge of slavery plagues us and divides us as a nation 150 years after there hasn't been any slavery. Because slavery was not consistent with the principle that the country was founded on. And many of the founders knew that. Thomas Jefferson wrote that he knew the judgment of God would come because of this, but they were unified in this one part of it. They didn't know how to get out of it. Because see, sin's a lot easier to get into than it is to get out of. By the time you had 3 million slaves, you had to ask yourself, and many of the founders of our country knew slavery was wrong and they knew it should be abolished. They said, what happens if we abolish slavery tomorrow? We have 3 million people. Where do they live? What do they do for a living? What happens to them? What happens to our culture with 3 million people who do not have a home and a job? And the truth is, it would have been an incredible drain on the economy to have fixed that problem for a while. And nobody wanted to pay the price. Turned out the price that we paid and are still paying was even higher. And that's always true, by the way. Folks can get into sin and they say getting out of sin, man, there would be a price tag to that. And there might very well be. But the price tag of staying in sin is always greater than the price tag of getting out of it. Which doesn't mean there isn't a price tag of getting out of it. Okay? The drunk who decides not to drink alcohol anymore is going to go through a terrible adjustment time. But the price tag of continuing to drink is going to be even worse. Y'all get the point? See, righteousness exalts a nation. The United States was being blessed for what it was righteous about. It still is. We had the curse of the Civil War, trying to figure out how to solve that which we've been wrong about, because this second principle is always true. Sin is a reproach to any people. And you cannot get away from that. And see, well, here's 100 principles that govern our nation, and if we're right with God about 90 of them, glory to God, righteousness exalts a nation in those 90 areas, but you still pay the price for those 10. Because sin's a reproach to people. Yes, I know a great deal of discussion today about treatment of the American Indians. And you understand as the United States began to be developed, colonies were established and so forth, there was a never-ending series of treaties with Indian nations. If you'll study the history of it fairly and honestly, the American Indian nations often broke treaties. And the United States government often broke treaties. Anytime either an American Indian nation or the American nation broke a treaty, that was sin, and that's a reproach to any people, and there were prices paid for it. We are still paying the price for that. It's just not normally noticed. I've done a fair amount of preaching out in Oklahoma, and I've been on some of the American Indian reservations there. And the dominance of sin and ungodliness in those reservations is tremendous because the welfare system the government has imposed as a solution for their problems. And my preacher friends know that. They understand that. Nobody seems to know how to get them all out of it, because if you took them all out of it tomorrow, there would be great, great hardship. And keeping them in it is great, great hardship as far as the eye can see. Because sin is a reproach to any nation. Now, there was a time this story would be told as if the Indians were always wrong and the Americans were always right. And that's just not real history. Today, the story is being told as if the Americans were always wrong and the Indian nations were always right. That's not real history either. But I can tell you this clearly. Righteousness exalteth a nation. Among the American Indian nations, where the gospel went first, God did some incredible things. Some incredible things. People look at the story of Kings Mountain, which is part of the War for Independence. Settlements out in Tennessee became aware that the British were going to send an army into Tennessee to try and take over them settlements, and they met, and they asked a preacher to preach to them about what their obligation was. And the preacher said their obligation was the protection of their families, and they discussed it, and they said, we can protect our families better by fighting the invading army on that side of the mountains than we can on them coming over here. They call them the over-the-mountain men. Over 1,100 of them, and they're described in history as a very rough lot, and I'm sure there's a measure of that that's true. But the fact is, before they did anything, they met together, and they had a preacher and asked the preacher to preach to them about what their obligation was. They had a lengthy prayer meeting, and then they set out to go over the mountains to protect their families. A couple parts of that story not often told. They meet the British go up on Kings Mountain. You can go there today, it's worth the trip. And you look at it, the British built these positions on top of Kings Mountain, and the colonists had to charge up the side of the mountain. I haven't charged up the side of the mountain. I've walked up the side of the mountain. I can't imagine running up it with people shooting at you. And Colonel Ferguson, in charge of the British forces there, made the statement. He said, this position is so secure that God himself could not drive me off of Kings Mountain. It had been named Kings Mountain after a farmer who farmed up there. He said, God himself couldn't drive me out of this position. So before they charged, again, they had a preacher preach to them, and they had a preacher pray. And when the preacher prayed, he prayed this. He said, Lord, would you show Colonel Ferguson today who the real king of Kings Mountain is? And they charge up the side of that mountain and win the most lopsided victory in the War for Independence. It's just incredible. You can't comprehend it going through. And I've done it. I've been up there. I've stood in their fortified positions, which are still there. I've imagined people charging up the side and how easy they would be to pick off. And I've walked up the mountain because on the best day of my life, I couldn't charge up the mountain. But I have walked up the mountain. Imagine myself being shot at on the way. I mean, it's just, you can't comprehend this. Colonel Ferguson's still buried up there, by the way. And it's the most lopsided victory you could possibly imagine. By the way, if you go there today and go in the bookstore, you wouldn't learn any of what I just told you. But I was up there years ago, and I bought a book in their bookstore that told the story. Just amazing. Righteousness. They had a motive that was right. Righteousness exalts a nation, and sin is a reproach to any people. But the reason those settlers knew their families were at risk is because the British were trying to hire the local Indian tribes to attack them. But they'd sent preachers among the local Indian tribes, and many of them had gotten saved, and they considered the settlers their brothers and sisters in Christ, and they did not want to go to war with the settlers, so they went to them and warned them about what was happening. Otherwise, they would have been taken by surprise. See, when the gospel went first, and by the way, there's so much to this. You read the autobiography of Geronimo. Most people don't know that he dictated an autobiography towards the end of his life. In the last chapter, he becomes a Christian and tells that story. It's incredible. And you can go on and on with that. Quanah Parker, the famous war chief of the Comanches, whose mother had been a kidnapped white woman, and his grandfather had been a fairly famous Baptist preacher, and who prayed over his daughter, and she gets carried away and kidnapped, and fathers a child, and he becomes a great war chief of the Comanche Nation. Most folks don't know the end of Quanah Parker's life. After the Comanches finally surrendered, he moved into town, became a Christian, became a member of the local church, and used his organizational abilities to run the local church's missions conference every year. It's a really incredible story. And he was famous for his organizational ability in cavalry battles. Turned out the same organizational ability worked in missions conferences. And that's the last chapter of the story, where the gospel went first. People like tell the story of the Nez Perce, and Chief Joseph said he was a different kind of Indian, and he did not want to stay in the United States anymore, wanted to get to Canada. And they tell the story of this 1,000-mile trek and how under his leadership, the Nez Perce tribe did not attack civilians. They paid for anything they took. They were not a threat to the local population. They don't like to tell you that he was a born-again, Bible-believing, evangelical Christian who preached to the members of his tribe that attacking innocent civilians was wrong. They should have let them go, by the way. They didn't want to be here. But the reason their tribe was different was not some tribal custom, but because they were believers. Righteousness exalts a nation. And so there were things about the United States exalted, and there's a lot of folks don't want to tell any of the history of that today. But it wasn't a perfect record. And when the nation was wrong, there was a price tag. Because sin is a reproach to any people. Never get the idea of a sacred nation that can do no wrong. There is no such thing. Righteousness exalts a nation. And the United States has enjoyed freedom and prosperity, unlike any nation in the history of the world. Whether anybody wants to face that or not, there is a reason why so many people from around the world want to come here. I mean, the same people who advocate open borders are telling you this is the worst nation in the history of the world, which doesn't explain why everybody wants to come here. I will tell you, traveling, and it's not 100% true, but it's amazing some of the places I've been where everybody wants to just meet you because you're an American, and the great dream of their life would be to come to America. It's an amazing thing. I've had people come up to me on the street in Syria to tell me how much they admire America. I've had people come up to me on the street in Vietnam to tell me how much they admire America. It's an amazing thing. In the Philippines and Cambodia, everybody's dream is to come to America. Righteousness exalts a nation. But sin is a reproach to any people. When you understand those two principles of government, you got a handle on the history of the world. When you understand those two principles of government, you've got a handle on American history. Because those two principles always hold up. And they're always there. God bless y'all.